Now it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Jasper von Woudenberg.
Thank you.
Have a good talk.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for coming. It's great to be back at Black Hat. Jeez, that's a tongue twister. A couple of months ago, I came across this picture, and I just stared at it in awe for a little while, even though I know what it is. It's kind of a cool piece of art and technology. It almost looks like alien technology if you look at it. So I've been in security for about 20 years, hardware security about 15. So I know what this bad boy is. And you know, if you don't, you probably are carrying a couple million or a couple billion of this in your pocket as well. It's also the hero and the villain of our story today. But I'll get into that in a second. So, like I mentioned, I've been in security for a while. Since last year, I can call myself an author as well. Together with Colin O'Flynn, I wrote a book on hardware hacking. And you might not be able to see it from the distance. That picture is a little outdated. It's more like this now. Let's get back to that pretty picture. So, what this actually is, it's a flip-flop. And a flip-flop is nothing more than sort of a 1-bit memory that is inside any chip. So it kind of holds the current state of a chip. And it's both what we need to have chips operate, but it also has a problem. And to understand that problem, we have to dig into a little bit on how these things work. So a flip-flop, it's like a 1-bit memory cell, if you will. It takes 2 inputs, a D, which is 0 or 1, and a clock. And it has an output, a Q signal. And all it does is, as soon as there's a rising edge in the clock, it stores the value of D. And from that moment on, the value of Q, the output, becomes D. And it holds this as long as the clock is stable or on a falling edge. Now, so far so good. That's sort of what it functionally does. The problem, though, I was alluding to is that it actually leaks a bit of information. So when the output switches from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0, the power consumption of the flip-flop is actually a little bit of a spike. Not much, obviously. It's just one cell. But it's more than if it's not switching. So conceptually, what you can do is, if at time equals 0, let's say we know that the input value is a 0, or it's actually stored as 0. And we measure a power spike. Now, we actually know that this bit has flipped from a 0 to a 1. And if we measure the power being constant, then we know that it has remained the same. So this becomes problematic when you look at algorithms like AES. So AES is an encryption algorithm. It takes in 128 bits of plain text. It has 128 bits of key, and it produces 128-bit ciphertext. And if you have a hardware implementation, oftentimes you'll have 128 flip-flops that each store 1 bit of the state. One of the first operations in AES is what's called a round key addition. And it basically takes the plain text and it XORs the key onto it. Now, the problem here, at least it might be a problem, is if we can measure the power consumption of each of these 128-bit flip-flops individually. Because we can assume we know the plain text. And if there's a power spike, then we know that the key bit was actually 1. Because the value changed, we XORed it. If the power stays pretty flat, we know that the key equals 0. So this is a problem. I'm going to, in this presentation, skim over lots of details. So you can ask me afterwards, but I'm not intending to make this into a 30-minute power analysis lecture. So there's some incorrectness here, but you know, just intuitively try to understand that this power relates to keys. There's another problem, though, in my argument, which is that I'm somehow assuming that I can measure the power consumption of a single flip-flop. Now, this turns to be a practical problem. And even though it may leak, you can't really easily measure that. So let's take a look at what we can do. So what you see here is same flip-flop again, but now in its context inside of a chip design. So you see all the squiggly lines, that's sort of inside the flip-flop, and all the other ones are the connections to the neighboring cells. So this can be other flip-flops and AND gates and OR gates and all that fine Boolean logic that sits on a chip. So let's zoom out a little bit. So this is what it looks like. You'll see more of these cells. If we zoom out even further, you see in these yellow bands, you see part of the, what's called the power distribution network. In the black squiggly still is our flip-flop there. Then we zoom out even further. You start seeing sort of the edges of the IP block that this is in. So on the left, it's a little bit wider, a little bit more space there. That's actually the edge where sort of the bus comes out. If we zoom out even further, now you can start seeing a couple of other blocks. So the one on the right is actually Pico RV32 core, which is a RISC-V, really small CPU. There's some memory interfacing logic on the left bottom side. And at the top, you see a 1 kilobyte SRAM. Amazing the size we have. Did I mention this is a really old technology, this chip? So this is actually the full chip. We taped this out as a test chip somewhere in June. On a 150 nanometer process. So it's like 20 years old or something. But it's something you can do on a very small budget. So there's a couple of Pico cores in here and a couple AES cores in that memory, et cetera. We're just going to play with it once we get it back, do some side channel and fault experiments on it. So we've sort of zoomed out from this one flip all the way to an entire chip. And that we can measure. So we can take a chip. You see on the right-hand side of this picture in the green PCB, you see another chip, not the one I just showed you, but you see a PCB. We can do electromagnetic probing of that, so you see a little probe over it. We can do current probing, that's the little yellow box to the side of it. And on the left, you see an oscilloscope where we capture these signals. And for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to talk about power analysis. Electromagnetic analysis is similar in a way, enough that I don't have to talk about the differences here. So how can we use these signals to actually extract the full key? Because we can't measure the individual flip-flops. But what we can do is we can take lots of measurements of AES operating, take power traces, take EM traces, and then perform a magic trick called correlation power analysis. And what CPA for short, what CPA does is you take an AES engine, you send it various plain texts, differing plain texts, and what you're going to try to do is you're going to try to model what the power would look like if a certain key byte would be correct. So I'm going to say, well, if my key byte is 0, then I kind of know by the design of IAS what bit flips I should see given a certain plain text, and I can match that against the trace. If my match is correct, then I say, well, that's probably a right part of the key. And I'm doing this for sub-keys, so in this case, a key byte. I'm making 256 predictions. I'm going to do that for each key byte. And sort of the one that matches where the model matches my leakage best, I'm going to call that the right key. And I rinse and repeat this 16 times, and then I have the full key. So this is, again, a bit hand-wavy, but just for you to get an understanding that we can apply statistics and sort of using this modeled power consumption, we can match it against reality and find out what the key should look like. But there's a problem here. We're doing this post-silicon. So we have a chip actually in our lab, and as soon as you find leakage, you're too late. You can't fix that chip anymore. You feed it back to the manufacturers, and they say thank you, and we're going to fix the next chip iteration, or maybe 2 down the line, depending on what their manufacturing pipeline looks like. So yeah, with post-silicon, we can fix the next chip. And what I'm going to try to argue today is pre-silicon, we can fix the current chip. And we do that by simulation. The chip doesn't exist yet, so this is the best we can do. So what are the ingredients that we need for this? There's sort of four basic ones. One is that chip design. So you need what's called a net list. And a net list is nothing more than basically all the gates in a chip and their connections. So a bunch of AND gates, OR gates, NOT gates, et cetera, plus the connections between them. That's a net list. Ideally, you also want to know where things are placed, but for the purpose of some simulations, you don't. Then we need to know the behavior as well. So if we send a particular plaintext to this net list, what are all the toggles that are sort of logically happening? So for each of the gates, you kind of capture the state. Is it, outputting a 1 or a 0 over time? And you put this in what's called a VCD file. So that's sort of the logic side. Then in order to convert that logic to power, we need models for each cell. And these are contained in what's called Liberty files. Basically, for every cell, it explains when transitions happen, what the power consumption is. So all of these inputs you feed into your favorite power simulation tool, and you run it on your beautiful mainframe that you have in your lab. And then you can essentially do the same. We did before with the power traces. But before I get into that, that mainframe isn't very fast. Don't do it on that one, actually. But on a modern CPU, these simulations are actually quite doable. So if you focus on what you see in this table is a number of AES cores we've tried this on. And in the rightmost three columns, you see for different simulation accuracies, so one at RTL, one post-synthesis, and one post-place and route, how long it took for us to simulate 256 traces. And this all varies from half an hour to like 13 hours or so. So definitely not like enter and you have your results, but this is something you can run overnight and still get a bunch of traces. So just like with the oscilloscope before, we now take these same traces, we run plain text, we run our modeling, we run our CPA, and out comes leakage or not. And that usually shows up like some sort of correlation trace, as we call it, with a peak somewhere. And that peak indicates, well, at this point in time, there's a statistically significant leakage. It's something that could be exploited to get keys out of a system. There's a problem with this. How do I go from this to actually fixing my design? And that's kind of where the research that we did starts. So when something leaks doesn't actually help fix it. You can only observe that it leaks and at what point in time, but it doesn't tell you, like, these are the gates that you have to go and fix. So that's where our research called SCATE comes in. It's all blue team stuff. We're going to go fix stuff now, so if you're a red teamer, go on to hacking. So we know when in time something's happening, but where is it leaking? So the idea behind this is that we are going to correlate net switches to a leakage model. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take the logic on a chip, and remember, as soon as something switches, it consumes more power. So if we see during the when period, so on the right-hand side, we call the red box the leakage time interval, but basically the part of the time when something leaks. And we can statistically look at the peaks in power there as well. Now, if a particular net always sort of seems to correspond to its switches with a higher peak on the right-hand side, you can argue there's actually a statistical relation between those two. So you can start going down to nets that leak inside of a chip. And what comes out of this is basically a ranked list of leaky gates. So you can start arguing, in this small contrived example, it's actually the S boxes that seem to leak. So let's take a little bit deeper look at the math here. So when we have these VCD traces, what we're actually going to do is we're going to apply a very simple transformation on it. Because the theory is, as soon as something switches, it will consume more power. So our power model is, as soon as a particular net switches, it consumes power 1. If something doesn't switch, then it consumes power -1. And that's enough of a power model. Like, we're doing correlations on this. We don't have to do anything too fancy. And we calculate this for every net and for every simulation that we run. Then we take these test vectors, and we're going to match for every net, for every simulation, where do the toggles basically align with small increases in power, and if something doesn't toggle, where does it align with a lower power consumption. And from that, we do basically a Pearson correlation. So we can correlate for every net how much it contributes to the power leakage. And that gives us basically the point in the chip where the leakage is, at the very lowest level. Like, we're talking about nets, which are driven by an output gate, and you can go back to the gate where it leaks. So once we've established that, we can start sort of zooming out again. Because individual gates are also, if you're a software person, it's looking at individual bits of a binary, right? They don't make a lot of sense until you start sort of reverse engineering, and ideally going back to your source code where that particular bit has meaning again. So similar in hardware design. So hardware designs are always sort of hierarchical. So what I showed you before, in terms of the chip layout, we have the top level, as they call it. Then we have, the RISC-V cores and a bunch of AES cores, and then you zoom into AES, and that has like a round logic, and inside the round logic there's S boxes, and it goes all the way down, and eventually you get to individual gates. So if you tell your synthesis tool, like, maintain the hierarchy or track the hierarchy, you can go back from gates to basically parts of the original design. And what I find kind of cool, this is one of our earlier results, where you never know when you start applying your method what it's going to come up with. But immediately we saw that the S boxes sort of floated to the top. So this long list is basically parts of the hierarchy. The individual dots you see are individual gates. And the shading is that correlation value. So the darker the color, the higher the correlation, the more it leaks. And the more dots, the more of these gates there are in a particular part of the hierarchy. So you see those S boxes, they have the most gates and also the highest leakage. And that's where you would expect it. This was an unprotected implementation. So this was really sort of a nice validation of what we were doing. There's also some other parts of the hierarchy where it's obvious, like there's round key generation and key memory, but there's other stuff where the name doesn't really say, hey, I'm leaking, to me at least, like block registers and who knows what. So this analysis already starts showing some areas where you wouldn't necessarily think there's leakage. We can go up even further. This was another experiment where we took yet another AES core. On the left, top left, you see these PQAS/G something. So these are the gate numbers that come out of the synthesis tool. And each of them is related back to basically a line and a character in the source code file. And this is part of that leaky gate list. And it was kind of cool to see that at least these 4 gates, they all went back literally to the XOR operation, where we took data and key and we mixed them together. So this is that add round key operation I was talking about earlier as well. So yeah, from sort of very high level and doing statistics, we went down to gates, and then we went back up to the source code. But now we're sort of in the land where developers can do something about it. Right now you know where your problem is. So the next step is countermeasure testing. So the attacks that I'm just talking about, they've been around for 2.5 decades or so now. So people have been thinking about all kinds of countermeasures for a while. And obviously, when you put them in silicon, you can measure them. And again, there the problem is if you find leakage, it's too late. So let's do countermeasure testing in simulation. And really the question that you're asking is does it work? Right? Before you write your code, you don't really know if it's very heavily armored or whether it's fluffy. I have to bore you a little bit with masking. So masking is a common countermeasure. You can look up, there's various literature about it. Really what it's doing intuitively, it's trying to break the relation that CPA is exploiting. So with CPA, we take like data which we know and an unknown key, and we're going to start making predictions about this key. What masking does is it adds a third variable. So we have data, a key, and some random variable that keeps on changing every time. And we can't predict this. It actually breaks our ability to match the leakage model to the data that's being processed. And masking work, this is masking in AES. On the left-hand side, it's sort of vanilla AES. On the right, it's with masking. You see everywhere these plus X's. These are basically XOR operations where we XOR some mask onto the data. And what's really important is that you make sure that your data is always masked and that the mask regularly rotates. There's some other attacks that you can do if the mask is constant everywhere. So you see this variable X keeps on changing, and then eventually, sort of at the end of AES, you unmask your value, and then you have the ciphertext. So we did a case study. So we implemented our own AES design, and we added some just off-the-shelf literature masking to that. And first, we turned off the masking. So we had the same design, but we could turn it off, or I think we basically made the mask always 0 or something like that. So we didn't change the design. We just turned off masking. And what we can do then is run our CPA. In this case, TVLA, but let's just say CPA. And we see these red dots, which basically indicate when there's leakage. So we know that this thing leaks. That's as predicted. The countermeasures were off. So what we're expecting is now that once we turn the countermeasures on, all these red dots should disappear, according to theory at least. Now, of course, that didn't happen. So on the left-hand side, you see the no masking picture. On the right-hand side, you see it with masking. And even though the number of leakage points went from 10 to 5, there was still leakage there. And it was significant, and it would be enough to break this implementation. And we didn't understand it at first. Because when we looked at the source code, it all looked fine, like the masks were being passed. So we used skate, and we started going down to the gate level and trying to figure out, in this case, we actually had to stay at gate level to figure out what was going on. And what turned out is that the synthesis tool, for software people, your compiler, decided to optimize the design, and it flipped 2 XOR operations around. Now, these 2 operations happen to be the remasking. So normally when you remask, you first apply the new mask with an XOR, and then you XOR out the old mask so that you never have sort of an unmasked value. But the synthesis tool was optimizing, and somehow these tools never optimize for security. And it flipped these things around. So it first unmasked, which means that the values are in the clear for a little while, and then it remasked. So it completely threw off the countermeasure. So yeah, once you have that insight and you dig into it, then you can find out what's going on. You can tell your synthesis tool basically don't optimize certain things, and then it maintained the operation. And on the right-hand side, take note of the y-axis here. That's a bit zoomed in. There's no more red dots, essentially. The leakage is gone as we would have originally expected. And when you looked in the netlist, yeah, the orders of the masks was maintained. Well, that's all really nice, but it's not just about the AES core itself. And that's, I think, an insight that we've gradually been getting as we dig more into the details. Because historically, sidechain, at least from our point of view as a lab, we were just testing chips. We didn't have designs. We didn't have this kind of insight. Like it either leaked or it didn't, and we kind of knew what the position on the chip was where it leaked if you're doing EM. But now we have sort of an unprecedented look into all the details of what was going on. So we're like, let's just zoom out a little bit and take an entire SoC and then try to simulate that. Because maybe the AES core is fine, but we don't know if the rest of the house is on fire. So we took an SoC, which is a little different than the one I just showed you. But it's basically a small SoC with a CPU core, some peripherals, some memory, and an AES accelerator. And we loaded this piece of software on it. And basically what you're seeing here is that it's in sort of in the blue instructions there, it's first loading the plain text. So it's loading 32 bits from memory, and then it's storing it in the AES engine and doing that 4 times, so it transfers 128 bits. Then it does the same for the key, so it's loading 32 bits at a time, storing it in the AES engine, and then the CPU basically says go encrypt, and it's going into a busy wait. So it actually just kind of pulls the AES engine for, are you done, are you done, are you done, are you done? So we put this in our power simulations. And this is sort of a very common look if you're used to looking at power traces where you sort of see the CPU doing something first. Well, in this case, we know it's writing the plain text and the key. Then it switches to the AES engine, says, go. And you see sort of this higher activity. Like AES engines, they have a lot of switching activity, way more than the simple CPU here. So you expect more power consumption, and you see that here. If you squint a little bit, you can see like 10 round repetitions happening as well, which are the 10 rounds of AES. And after that, the CPU takes over again and retrieves the ciphertext. What I found really cool is you can actually see some of the sort of the internals of the CPU behavior as well. So from your computer architecture 101 class, you may remember pipeline hazards and pipeline stalls. So what's happening in the CPU is when it fetches to 32 bits from memory, it actually already starts executing that store instruction. But the store instruction needs to wait for the data to come into the CPU before it can actually do the store. And you see that in these little divots in the power consumption there. So you see this really, you can kind of trace every instruction through its execution. And then near the end, the CPU kicks off the AES accelerator, and then it kind of holds there. Now, apart from geeking out over that, let's go back to leakage. So this was, again, an AES engine with no countermeasure, so we expect leakage here. But what we also saw, maybe not entirely unexpected, was a whole bunch of leakage before the AES engine even started. So you see a couple of little peaks that align with round 1 of the AES. That's just leakage from the AES engine. But there's a whole bunch of stuff happening before that. And it's kind of interesting if you look at this from a designer's point of view. Because very often you have a hardware designer who makes an AES engine, and they'll work on the countermeasures, and maybe they'll even simulate it, and they figure out that it's all fine. And then there's also a software developer who says, I'm just following I'm writing my code in C. Microarchitecture or SOC layouts are not my domain. I can't really fix anything there. But maybe there's a whole bunch of leakage that's happening there. So there's sort of a gap when you engineer these chips in who really looks at the leakage that's happening outside of the AES engine. And we can zoom into that a little bit further, because we can locate where these gates are, we can locate where they are in the hierarchy, and we actually find that there's a whole bunch of leakage that's happening in the RISC-V CPU, which you may expect, right? It's handling key material. It's kind of cool that you can kind of see where it is. It's in the ALUs and in the register files, et cetera. But what surprised us is that actually the peripherals were leaking key material as well. And that's surprising because it's not their job to deal with key material at all. The problem is they're hanging off of the same bus as the CPU and the AES engine. So as soon as key material is being transferred over that bus, there's some transistor activity there, even though they might not actually do anything with that data. There's still some switching activity there that sort of amplifies the leakage. So yeah, one of our conclusions here really was leakage is found in unexpected places. If you don't look, you're not going to find it. So a little bit about future work. Future work meaning we dream of this, it doesn't exist today. One of the insights we had is if you look at the leaky gates only in the design, it's actually quite a subset of the full design. So when you talk, for instance, about AES counter or AES masking countermeasures, these things double the area, which is expensive. If we can isolate the leakage to like 10, 30% of the design, even if we would like double the area on only those gates, we'd still be cheaper than doing a full-blown masking. So we're sort of looking at this from a countermeasure injection standpoint. Like if we have this list of gates, can we do a netlist transformation to get a more secure design out? Once you have that, you can also start thinking about design space exploration. So hardware designers are often trading off power, performance, area. And security is actually a fourth dimension in that. So security comes at a cost, either power, or performance, or area. So once you start looking at security as, hey, we have a list of leaky gates, I can try applying countermeasures on the top 10 gates, and on the top 100 gates, and the top 1,000 gates, and see how it affects my power, performance, and area. And as a designer, I can start making these trade-offs between security and the cost of it. And then finally, in hardware design, there's sort of an important point called sign-off, where you take various metrics over your design, and you say, OK, this is good enough to go into fabrication. And really what we would love to see is basically a security sign-off as well, or we said this is secure enough to go into fabrication. And we can come up with a bunch of metrics based on side channel analysis that could help that. Before I get into conclusions, some caveats. So these simulations are limited by how many CPU cores you throw at it, but also the design size. So you didn't see the latest, Intel 12th generation core in my slides, because that's not stuff we can simulate. But AES cores, simple SoCs, definitely something that's within reach. And you could theoretically throw more CPU cores at the simulation as well and speed it up that way. Accuracy-wise, we're relying on these EDA simulators. So the reason we taped out that chip, which is coming back in October, keep your fingers crossed that they actually work, is so we have a full design, we can run it through Skate, and we can look at the chip and basically cross-check our results with reality. Now, these EDA simulators aren't new. They've been tested and tried for a long time, but they've been new in the side channel, or new usage in side channel is kind of new. So that's really the use case we're testing. So concluding, post-silicon, we can fix the next chip if we find leakage, but with pre-silicon, we can fix the current chip, but only if we know where the leakage is. If you just know when, that's not actionable. We also find that it's just doing manual review of designs is not sufficient. You really want to approach this with statistics, simulations, et cetera, because the leakage is found in unexpected places, and you're not going to find it if you don't know where to look. What gets me excited, actually, even though I apparently know a little bit about side channel analysis, to actually do this analysis, you don't need that much knowledge about it. So these tools are sort of within the domain of hardware developers, and those are the people who really have to fix it in the end. We don't want everybody to have to become a side channel expert. And then, yeah, there's a couple of interesting future directions in terms of automatic countermeasures, sign-off, and the silicon validation that I just spoke about. So I didn't do this alone. I stole a bunch of slides from one of my Skate colleagues, Patrick Somont at WPI. Yeah, have worked together with a number of institutes, so WPI, Purdue, and then Riskier and Intrinsics are two industry partners. We all made this happen. One cool shout out I want to do is to the Zero to ASIC course. If you want to get into hardware, maybe even tape out your own chip design, go talk to MedVen and follow this course. I've done it. I've had a lot of fun, and it was the basic basis for the chip out we did. And I don't consider myself a hardware designer at all. I'm not, but I made it work. And then there's a scientific paper here on the architecture correlation analysis you can have a look at. And if you're interested in the hands-on, not the simulated side of hardware hacking, you can also check out the book that Colin and I wrote. And with that, I have 4 minutes and 4 seconds for questions.